Hello and welcome to part 3 of the series. We'll cover patterning and furring this time. Here is when I like to finish off the lining. Pull down the lining flat inside the head and stick it down where it meets the bottom jaw. Pinning the excess lining out of the way makes this less fiddly. What you should have now is fully lined inside and around the eyes. Go from inside the mouth and cut a small hole. This part is similar to when we lined the eyes. Cut into it and pull the lining into the mouth, sticking it down flat as you go. To line the visible part of the mouth, I cut just a rough shape out of fleece, just enough to cover the area, and then pull and stretch and glue it down till it's flat, and then afterwards I'll cut off the excess, and that's how I line the mouth. Sometimes I will pattern it with tape if it's a bit of an odd shape, but generally it's pretty easy just to put a bit of fleece in and stick it down. Here I went for pink, but for the most part you generally want darker colours in the mouth. And you can always use little darts and stuff. One of the easiest ways to do the nose is just to take a square of the fabric you're going to use and put it the wrong way onto the nose, pinning it in place. If you have a symmetrical nose, you can just sew directly around it. So here you can see I've pinned it until I've got it to the way I want it, and then I'm just hand sewing it to fit the shape. And then when I'm done, I'll cut off the excess and turn it the other way round, so it'll be a perfect fit because I've sewn it while it's on the base, so it'll fit a lot better than even if you patterned it. So this is quite a good way because not only is it quicker than patterning, but it also gives a better fit. And you can see, just use a little bit of glue around the outside. Try not to put it in the middle of the nose because then you'll have lumps of glue under the nose, so this way it'll be a lot softer. And make sure you do leave a little bit of an edge because you don't want it to come up short when you put on the fur. You want to make sure it's neatly covered. With the ears, I'm just using masking tape because you don't need that much flexibility for these, but for the most part I use duct tape or gaffer tape. What I'm doing is I'm taping over the area where I want the fur to go, then drawing on where the markings are, pulling it off and cutting it into its shapes. And then you might need to cut little darts into it to flatten it. There'll be a better example of that later though. And because these ears are floppy, I'm then extending the pattern with just normal paper. I feel like I could have made these ears a bit bigger than I did and they would have looked better, but yeah, you can see the idea is if you're going for a floppy ear, you make an extension of the pattern, and with all of this it's all about fitting and refitting until you get what looks right. And you can see I do the same with the middle bit of the ear too. So generally for the middle of the ear I use either a fleece or a minky just because those give a nice contrast to the fur. And here you can see I'm cutting out the little pieces of the fur. For this I use a craft knife again to cut it. Just take your time, and you can use small scissors if you're just careful not to cut the fur. And really I should be using a cutting mat, but I always forget to. So this is where I'm making the middle part of the ear out of the fleece, and then these will just be sewn together like this. So the other is an example. I sew one side together before sewing the two sides to make the whole ear. And I think it looks nicer if you do have a bit of a gradient on the ears, and shorter fur on the ears generally looks quite nice. So you can see I just took off a lot of the furs on the ends with a little bit of hand trimming, but I'll go over those again later. That's why I didn't secure them on. Also, it's quite nice not to have too much of the fabric stuck down at this point because you don't want to accidentally damage it during the next steps. So here you can see I'm patterning the base. I do this by covering half the face in duct tape. You only need to do half if you've got a symmetrical face. Even though these are asymmetrical markings, I just change the pattern, which is extremely annoying to do because you'll see later on, I get quite confused about which side I'm working with, but if it's symmetrical, you only need to do half, and then also this way you'll have a more symmetrical pattern when you sew on the fur. And just cover this with as much as you need. You can see where I'm doing something a bit different. I'm using different tapes, and to do the neck, just tape a couple of long bits straight down to your base of your shoulders. If you don't have a mannequin head with shoulders, you could always make a version of your shoulders by taping them up and then making that into a base, because that's very useful for necks. I always used to struggle to get a nice neck shape before I had this new base. And here you can see I'm just readjusting those ears constantly. And with these pieces, you really want to label everything. So label the colour, the fur direction, and you can see where I have cut the piece off, I've got little markers so that when I sew it back up, I'll connect those markers up, and that means you'll get straighter, neater pieces. And it just also saves you time working out how the pieces go together, because you can do marks at different intervals to sort of help guide you. So here I'm just showing what they'll look like. I find it's really useful every time you cut the piece to pin it in the section where it's going to go, so that you don't lose it or muddle it up, especially if you're doing asymmetrical stuff. So I'm just cutting a piece off at a time because there's no point cutting it all off, you'll get confused what's going on. And I'm cutting some of them into smaller segments because the segments are too large to sew in one go, or my fabric's not big enough. If you're using a dark coloured tape, I would suggest getting metallic Sharpies or something similar. They'll show up really well against dark colours. Or else you can get white gaffer tape or duct tape. With each piece, what I do is I'll take the taped pattern off the head and trace it onto the fur, making sure to get any of those little markings to line it all up. And what you need to do is, if you're only taping half the head, then you'll want to make one copy of each side. So you want to draw it out, then flip it and draw it again. You can see I used newspaper to make sure that the tape didn't start sticking to itself. I don't do this for all pieces, but if you've got a large or fiddly piece, it can be really helpful just to stop it sticking to everything you don't want it to. And you'll want to cut out any of the darts that you've made to flatten the pattern. And you can see I'm just test fitting it to see how it goes and keeping it all together. And again tracing it out. So it'll be a lot of just doing that repeatedly until I've got the whole face. And I find it's also quite motivational just to put the pieces on. So this is what I mean by flattening it out. So this is the bottom jaw, and I'm just snipping into it to cut a little triangle into it. Then you just sew this up to get your rounded edges. So again, you can see I wrote chin. It's really important to write all of this. And later on, I'm not sure if I cut it or not, but there was this whole segment where I know I spent about half an hour trying to work out which side was supposed to be which colour based off my pattern. And I think it turned out I'd cut a piece wrong and then had to go back and recut it. And if you don't have that much of the fur, you really want to try and avoid that wherever you can. And you can see in some places I've got little letters. That's because those are going on to things like the nose. So I've got an N for nose. I think B for that beef base, I think it was. I don't remember what that was, but the idea that I might need to leave a little bit extra so that I can fold over the edges because it's the edge of the piece. I think around the eyes I didn't think there was enough tape, and I wanted to go back and really get the shape of that eye. So here on this base I went over the top of the eyelid. I don't do that on all of them, but I think especially on the males, if you're trying not to have too much of a heavy eye, this can be really useful and gives it quite a nice finish as well. So yeah, this was the piece I had trouble with. I cut out one version and it turned out it was the wrong way round, so I had to go back and recut it. What I like to do is put all the pieces on the same sheet of fur, making sure to get the right fur direction, and once I've done that, these are all going to be cut down to the same length. So when I've drawn them all out, what I'll do is I'll then give them all a pre-trim. So yeah, I think I'm about to do this now. That's what all the pieces look like, all drawn out. So that's all the front of the face. And here I just give it a pre-trim, so I brush it all out first and do a fairly long blade on the clippers and just do straight to cut as much off as possible, and just keep going back to try and get it as short as possible. I think Matrice's recently put out a really good tutorial on how to pre-trim fur before putting it on the face, and this really helps as you're not working with such a bulky material and you're going to trim it down later, so it's easier to do it while it's flat. Now that I've pre-trimmed it, I'll cut it out again using a mixture of craft knife and small scissors. I think the small scissors I use are just sewing scissors, and the craft knife is a box cutter, I believe. I believe that's what it was called. So a lot of this is just being really careful not to cut the fur and keeping your pieces organised. Because as you can see, it begins to be quite a big pile of different bits. So one thing about deciding where to make your pieces, like what pieces to cut a face into, obviously there is wherever there's a marking, and base it off of where the fur direction changes. Here you can see I'm hand sewing up one of the darts I cut into it, so this will make it rounded around the nose. So I just hand sew all of these. In fact, I hand sew the whole of the face just with a loose tack-in or baste-in stitch. You know, just a really loose big stitch all the way around to make it a bit easier to run through the sewing machine afterwards. So when you're cutting into pieces, wherever the fur direction changes and wherever there's a bit of a difficult shape in the face, like generally I make the muzzle its own separate piece because the fur all changes around the eyes and the cheeks become one piece, as well as obviously the bottom jaw is very difficult to make along with anything else. And you can see I'm constantly making sure it all fits, and so here I'm going back to do the white to make sure that I've got all the pieces for the face. So again, starting off with that pre-trim, and here's an example of sewing fiddly markings. I do these completely by hand because it's quite difficult to get it right in a sewing machine, so I use what's called a blanket stitch, I believe. So whenever I go through, I just loop the needle through the thread. So I do this all the way around. For these, I do have a tutorial on how to do spots. The best advice I can give for when sewing complex markings like this is to make sure that you have the little marks to line it up with, because it's so easy to not have them and then they won't sit right, or you'll have way too much fabric on one side and not enough on the other. Here we see Saturn with all his messily trimmed pieces, not stuck down at all, but all the pieces are now sewn together. And again, I'm just checking that everything fits as the last few bits are sewn together. Just sewing the neck onto the rest of him, and then I believe I do the final trims on the ears. So just going around all those edges, trying to get them nice and neat and get the gradient on the ears nice and smooth, because once those ears are on, because they're floppy, it's going to be very difficult to trim them. And then I decided to sew these on just because I wanted a nice clean line between them. But you don't need to sew the ears onto the rest of it, you can just carefully glue up to the edge. I just felt for these ears it would give a better final look. So as always, fit in, and we're going to leave it here for this video. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully the final part won't take me so long to edit together. It will include all the finishes for this head. In the meantime, good luck with all your projects.